Why World War I? Why World War I? George just said, gee whiz, how many people died on the first day? Now, he knew the answer, but as many people died on the first day or were injured on the first day of the Battle of the Somme in 1916 as in the Vietnam War. 60,000 people were either killed or injured on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. If we look at our century, the century that's just passed, and if we look even at our own time period, almost everything still filters through the impact of World War I on European society, on Eastern European society, on America, on Asia, on Africa, on the Middle East, Latin America probably being the continent the least affected by it. In other words, there is hardly anyone on this planet who was not in some way affected by World War I, and in every single dimension, what the war involved was radicalization, polarization, and an acceleration of history. In other words, it's not that it started each of the tendencies, but all of the tendencies that existed at the end of the 19th century passed through the prism of World War I and were changed in some way, usually for the worse. Usually for the worse. Now, there are a lot of women here. I can't say whether you got the better of it or the worse of it. What I can say is there were a lot of fewer men sitting around after the war. But women in the workplace in certain fields went up 20%, 40%, 60%, multiple hundreds of percent. So women got out of the barn and gained a lot of liberty. And what did the guys do when they came back from the war? Stuck them back in the barn as hard as they could. Tried to repress them. For fear of all of this radical change, everything these men had to deal with on the battlefield, and then come home to uppity women? I mean, there were Mel Gibsons all over the place. They were like sissies compared to the guys who came back after the war. And I'm not kidding. Because part of fascism as a movement is anti-womanhood. Okay? Fascism is misogynist. Fascism wants women in their place. Fascism is militarist, hyper-militarist. You could never have had a Mussolini coming to power in Italy. When? Anyone know when did Mussolini come into power in Italy? 22! Okay, so Hitler gets all of the attention. He comes into power in 33. And yes, Mussolini is pale compared to Hitler. But you could never have had a Mussolini, the child of a blacksmith, come into power in what was still predominantly an aristocratic society, a hierarchical society, a clerical society, without World War I. So no Mussolini, no possibility of Mussolini without World War I. No possibility of Adolf Hitler without World War I. A corporal telling generals what to do? Not possible. Not possible. It's not that there wouldn't have been Mussolinis in society or Hitlers in society. It's just that they would have remained where they belonged, out of power. Okay? As minority cranks. The economies. Radical dislocation of the economies. Runaway inflation. Now, we know what it means. I stupidly went back in the market a little bit about 3 months ago. Everyone was pushing me to go back in the market. I came back from vacation and I took a look. Oh, that's great. I lost more than I made this year. No, fortunately not. But, okay, when you live through something like that, you can begin to perceive what it felt like to others to go through that. So we know about the German inflation. Everybody had inflation. The French franc was stabilized in 1928. The person who stabilized it, Poincaré, was called the savior of the franc. He devalued it by 80%, and he was called the savior of the franc. 80% devaluation. The German currency in the 1920s became literally valueless. The Italian currency was on that track when Mussolini came into power. Russian prices went up at least 4 times in the cities during the war. Well, people were starving at the beginning of the war. What do you think happened to them during the war? They starved more. No World War I, no Russian Revolution. Oh, maybe there would have been a revolution in Russia later. But who came up on top during the revolution? The most radical faction. Why did they come up on top? Because the other socialists who were predominantly in power continued the war. And in continuing the war, they made it impossible to continue their revolution. Lenin said, we can either make war or we can make revolution. I'm all for revolution. To hell with the war. And they sued for peace. And in the peace they finally got from Germany, they lost 30% of their industrial capacity, 35% of their manpower. War or revolution, not both at the same time. So first, the revolution is a product of the war. It might have happened in a different way later, but you would never have had a Lenin coming to power in Tsarist Russia. Virtually impossible. No Lenin, no Russian Revolution, fascism wouldn't have looked that lovely to everyone. No Lenin, no Stalin, probably also no Hitler coming into power, because what the people who put Mussolini into power in 22 and the people who finally allowed Hitler into power in 33 were afraid of is a Lenin or Stalin for Italy or for Germany. Other things, modernist culture, the radicalization of political ideology everywhere, both on the right and on the left. The whole nature of the Middle East today is a product, to a great extent, of the settlements after World War I, which begin to radicalize the Middle East. America becoming the center of the world economy. Who was the greatest debtor nation in 1914? The United States. Who built the West? The Europeans. Who financed America? The Europeans financed America. Who was the greatest creditor in 1918? The United States. So the whole balance of economic structure in the world shifted between 1914 to 1918. France was a creditor nation. Britain was the greatest creditor nation. Germany was a creditor nation. They all were radically debtor nations 4 years later. And I could go on and on and on with these particular areas of change. No World War I, no appeasement. Where did you ever hear of English society practicing appeasement before World War I? Never. No World War I, What was the nature of French defensive history in the 1930s? What was that string of fortresses called? Maginot Line. To do what? To hide behind? No World War I. No Maginot Line. What did the French army do in the beginning of World War I? Does anyone remember? Afterwards, right? Afterwards they did. But in the beginning, they went forward just like the Germans did, right? And what happened when they went forward? Anyone know what kind of caps they were wearing? They were red. I mean, that's smart, right? And you know, machine guns like red. They like red. And running forward with a bayonet into machine guns with a red hat on is an act of manhood. It's a sign that you have the will to power. You have no fear. The war killed lots of people. More of them were the stronger people rather than the weaker people. If this had been a classroom in France in 1914, almost all of the men in this classroom would have gone into the battle. And if they hadn't, you wouldn't want to hear the things the woman would have said to them. And I, as a faculty member, would have been telling you to go into the battle. And the sooner the better for the honor of France. Of all men ages 20 to 32 in France in 1914, half were dead by 1918. Half of you would have been dead. To be a healthy male in France in 1914, to have been mobilized, to have gone to war, and to not have even died or been badly wounded would be statistically improbable. Purely statistics. Guns don't care about... No, they do. Machine guns like bigger size. It's a bigger target. Right? In the beginning of the war, I don't know if any of you got a chance. I understand this was hard to get. Some things I didn't know. One of the things I did is I prepared for this. When I get called upon to do something like this, I don't sit on my hands. These are two of my new toys, okay? And one of the things that I'm going to be doing is probably changing the books in my course and using this for my 20th century history. Barbarism and civilization, the history of the 20th century. Ferguson, the War of the World, 20th century conflict, and the descent of the West. And not just the West, but the rest also. Eastern European civilization as well as a result of the war. In the beginning of the war, you had to be about 5'8" to get in the British Army. By a year and a half later, you could be 5'1". The 5'8"ers were gone. Okay? And you can see how honor-bound, patriot-bound a society was, because they didn't even have military conscription until 1916. It was a volunteer army. An entire football team would volunteer, and they were called pals, and they put them together on the front line. So entire football teams disappeared. The French military class of Saint Cyr in 1914, the best the country has to offer, 63% died. Now, normally, it was 2 disabled for 1 who died, or even 3 disabled for 1 who died. 63% of the best. So who was left to stand up to Hitler later, or Stalin later? Where were all of those leaders who died and whose blood soaked the landscape of Europe by 1918? Why did this happen? I mean, they weren't totally stupid. They thought it was going to be a short war. Everybody thought it was going to be a short war. The Germans expected to spend Christmas. The war began in August. The Germans expected to spend Christmas in Paris. Well, that's a good place to spend Christmas. I have spent Christmas and New Year's, or not Christmas, but New Year's in Berlin. That's a good place now, too. Then it wasn't quite as good. The French expected to be to Berlin and back to Paris to also spend Christmas in Paris. Okay? There were several people around who thought it would be longer. Most thought this would be a short war. One of the causes of the war is what is called the short war illusion. The idea that the war would be short is one of the reasons that they went into it that way. The Germans had a particular plan. It was pretty much like the French plan, only it was German. So it was more daring. The Germans were going to go through Belgium and come across and encircle Paris within 6 weeks, leaving their eastern frontier a little bit open. And I'm on the wrong map because I changed the maps before. So this is 1914. So they might even have allowed some of these primitive barbaric Russians into East Germany. And that was called the Schlieffen Plan. And tragically, it became the only plan for operation by 1911. They had many plans before. One of the lessons for there aren't that many lessons that really pertain. And even if the lessons pertain, how do you use them? One of the lessons that might pertain is you always have to have more than one military option. You always have to have more than one military option. By 1911, the Germans threw away all the other military options. And everything was based on train tables. How fast can you mobilize? So this is what they had left. This plan required a two-front war. Beat the French quickly, use superior railroads, get back and slowly defeat the Russians. Attack. The French were going to do the same thing. Attack from the south, but with red hats on. This thing almost worked. Okay, this thing almost worked. They smashed through Belgium. They pushed aside the British and the French. They smashed into France. They got to the Marne River. They left their flanks open. The French counterattacked. And the Battle of the Marne failed. Barbara Tuchman. Another book. In fact, these folks who were the best talk about Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August, which I read 3 times when I was in my 20s, is still being a valuable study. The Battle of the Marne was one of the decisive battles of the world, not because it determined that Germany would ultimately lose or the Allies ultimately win the war, but because it determined that the war would go on. The Battle of the Marne determined that the war would go on. The Schlieffen Plan failed. So the war wasn't going to be over in 6 weeks, in 3 months. It wasn't going to be over. So what did they do? They raced to the sea, up the coast, trying to outflank each other. They got there at about the same time, and they were looking at each other. Now this is the Western Front. So what did they do next? They dug trenches. And after that, they dug deeper trenches. And a second line of trenches. And a third line of trenches. And they looked at each other. And by that time, hundreds of thousands of people were dead and wounded. Now, the war in the Eastern Front was totally different. There, the Germans, over time, clearly outmaneuvered, in fact, very early in the war and at the Battle of Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes, destroyed and captured very, very large parts of the Russian army. The Russian capacity to endure was remarkable, considering the kind of weapons that they had at their disposal, and in many cases only one rifle for 3 soldiers sometimes. So you waited till one fellow fell and you picked up another one, and World War II wasn't too different in the beginning. That was a war of movement where people froze to death. As many froze to death and died from injury as directly from the battle. And by the way, about 70% of all people who were killed from bombardment. 60 to 70%. Not eye to eye, not hand to hand, bombardment. Okay? So what the Battle of the Marne meant is a longer war. Well then, how will we win? We will mobilize. So we mobilize. And we come up to this. And they come up to this. We go there. They go there. We go there. They go there. Total mobilization of society. The first war of routinized, mechanized, industrial slaughter. 4 years. No complete breakthrough until the American troops really arrive. The Germans are as close to winning 4 years later as they were 4 years earlier, but the two civilizations are roughly equal in the capacity to produce the necessities of war: fuel, munitions, food, technology. The Germans passed a law in 1916 requiring men up to age 65 to work. The French, it was up to age 60. Men up to 46 in the army. By the end, Germany, men in their 50s on the front. Kids 15, men 50 on the front. All the capacity of modern industrial society straining at the bit for destruction. Straining at the bit for destruction. One of the French soldiers called it extermination. I call it routinized, mechanized genocide. The genocide of people on their own citizens. Because once it got out of control, they had no way of stopping it. Oh, let's negotiate. What do we say to the 500,000 parents who've lost children when we negotiate and haven't gained anything? They never stopped to negotiate because they were afraid they couldn't get the troops to move again. Okay? This is a barrier that 20 years later, 25 years later, permits the Holocaust to happen. This is extermination of your own citizens, your best citizens. 10,000, 20,000 at a time. Daily. Daily. One of the German attempts in 1915, 1916 is known as the Battle of Verdun. Okay? The purpose of the Battle of Verdun was not necessarily to take Verdun, but to force the French to defend Verdun and to exchange blood. The purpose was to bleed France white. But in the process of bleeding France white, Germany was bled white. And to take pressure off Verdun, the British took upon themselves the Battle of the Somme to take the pressure off Verdun. It just got worse and worse and worse. Some statistics. 65 to 70 million men were mobilized. More men were mobilized than the entire population of England or France or Italy or Spain. Germany had about 65 million people in 1914. Of every 7 mobilized, 1 was killed, about 9 or 10 million people. Of every 3, 1 was disabled, 1/3 permanently so. Now, what did disabled mean in World War I? People walked around with iron masks. The medicine wasn't the same as ours. mangled faces, faces without chins, without noses, without skulls. I remember going to France in the late 60s, and still seeing mutilated people from World War I. And there were signs in French trains and buses at that time to stand up and make place for people who were mutilated from World War I. The mutilated people, the people without faces. The shell shock. They didn't call it post-traumatic stress syndrome, but tens and tens and tens, hundreds of thousands of people had shell shock, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and all kinds of other ailments that they didn't have names for then. So the war never ended. The war produced its own progeny. Between August 1914 and the end of 1917, one Frenchman was killed every minute. And again, it's Darwin to the reverse. It's not the survival of the fittest. The fittest go first. It's not even a war like Vietnam in which the poor were more likely to fight than the middle class. Because the whole moderate middle officer corps was made up of the children of aristocrats and wealthy middle-class people. So what was decimated is the middle class. This is a bourgeois war. Everybody takes part, but it's a middle-class war. There was no aristocrat who didn't lose a child, a cousin, a brother, a parent, a husband. No aristocrat who said, I'm not going to fight. Okay, they may have been officers, but even if they were majors, they were still going to be close to the front. Captains, they'd get up over the parapet, lead the charge, blow the whistle. Any of you see Paths of Glory? Right? Isn't that a great movie with Kirk Douglas? Isn't it exquisite? Right? Colonel Dax, the finest lawyer in France. What does he do when the battle begins? He stands up and blows the whistle and he leads the charge. And he's the finest lawyer in France. Oh yeah, there are some fat generals in the back. And there are some other generals not shown in that film on the front. Okay? Generals who went to the front were really respected by their men. But this is a counter-Darwinian war. 5,509 people on the average killed every day for over 1,500 days. 5,509 on the average for 5 years of warfare. Well, with all of that, it requires us to study other elements of the war. Not just the home front, or not just, rather, the war front, not just the trenches, not just the war of movement, but the home front as well. Because the home front I hate to even say it. Has anyone denied themselves something because we're fighting in Iraq? Has your life changed? Has your life changed because of Afghanistan? No political intention whatsoever. But has your life changed? Everyone's life. Is that a Weissman?
Yeah, Weissman died.
Good. I like the Weissman part. I'll accept the other part. Total mobilization of society affected everyone. And in all the combatant countries, the war behind the war was as important as the war in the trenches, because if you couldn't produce the weapons, if you couldn't produce the fuel, if you couldn't produce the food, you couldn't stay in the war. Okay, this is high stakes. You just keep putting more on the table. So in each of the countries, you had a series of processes that Gordon Craig calls political centralization, economic regimentation, and thought control. Now let's just think about those for a minute. Political centralization. The end of democratic politics. Really. The end of real politics for a while. Central governments taking more and more and more authority. In 1916 in England, and England had, together with France, the greatest tradition of civil rights anywhere, they passed an act called the Defense of the Realm Act. And according to that act, if I gave the kind of speech I'm giving today, I could have been put in prison for defeatism. Okay, although I don't know that I would have been against the continuation of the war at that point whatsoever. So much had already been cost. How can you stop without winning? How can you possibly cut it off? Again, all men between ages 15 and 65 in Germany having to serve the country. The government taking more and more and more power. Economic regimentation. One of the reasons the Russian Revolution occurred is because it was one of the countries that did the least well in political centralization and economic regimentation. Munitions czars came into being. Walter Rathenau in Germany, Albert Thomas in France. One an industrialist, the other a socialist. Both doing the same thing. David Lloyd George, a radical politician in England, getting the sinews of all domestic power for economic productivity that they possibly could in their hands and telling you what to produce and where to get it and for how much. End of the liberal economy. Thought control. Massive, massive, massive propaganda. Truth became lies. Massive, massive propaganda. The enemy is no longer another European who may have visited Paris. The enemy is a Hun. The enemy is a Kraut. The enemy is an animal. The men in the trenches knew better. But enforced enthusiasm to get people to pay for all the pain that they were experiencing. The end of truth. Truth and lie lost their valence. People lost the capacity to tell one from the other. Political centralization, economic regimentation, thought control. Put them together, and what do we have? We have the capacity for the development of the totalitarian state. These are models of government. And we all know that models that are tried do not disappear once they're tried. They become more reasonable thereafter when they have already been tried before, especially if they have been successful before. Liberal, democratic debate, constitutional rule, normal processes, largely put aside. And of course, the more dictatorial the regime was in the beginning, the more those processes were put aside. So this whole business of the war behind the war itself has a meaning of its own. And it is the further demise of 19th century liberalism. The further demise of the individual. The further demise of free society on one level or the other during these kind of times of crisis, which never fully goes away. Well, let's stop and look at some of the other changes that occurred as a result of the war and as a result of the war behind the war. And let's start with some of the structural changes and territorial changes that took place and ask ourselves, what do they mean? And I almost shouldn't do this too much because some of you, many of you may be attending the lecture I give tomorrow, and the two are going to flow one into the other. And I don't want too much of it to be repetitive. Because when you tell the story of the origins of World War II, you're telling the story, the effects of World War I. They flow into each other. The easiest changes to see, other than just death, doubled by the flu epidemic, by the way, of 1918, 1919, killed as many people as during the war, okay, are the demise of empires, and that's why we've got these two maps together. What's different about these maps? Where? Okay, all right, so Russia's larger here, right? Here it's 1/7, 1/6 of the globe. Here it's maybe 1/7 of the globe. Russia's larger. The Russian Empire collapses. It's the first to go. That's the Russian Revolution. The first revolution in March of 1918, or rather 1917. The second revolution in November of 1917. The Russian Empire collapses. Okay? What else is different? Yeah. Austria. The Austro-Hungarian Empire. Where is it? I don't see it. I'm hard to, I don't see well at all, but is this the Austro-Hungarian Empire? Oh, I'm sorry, other map. Thank you, other map. All right. The Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1914, 53 million people, more people than France, more people than Britain, more people than Italy. Gone. It explodes at the end of the war. And what you have is 9 million Austrians, 9 million or so Hungarians, a new Czech state, a new Polish state, changed, a new Yugoslavia, changed territorial structures everywhere in Central Eastern Europe. So the Second Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, collapses. The German Empire collapses as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And where is it? It's called the Ottoman Empire over here. It includes all this stuff down here, right? And over here it's called Turkey. What's a Turkey? Okay, what happened to the empire? 4 empires are destroyed. 4 empires collapse in a 2-year period. And instead, you have what is sometimes called the Balkanization of Eastern Europe, right? Here, you have 5 great powers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5. Okay, 6. Italy was the 6th by mutual lying. Italy was not really Italy was not really a great power, but it had a great history, so they allowed it to be a great power, which made the Italians misbehave very, very badly. And their desire to be a great power made them enter the war in 1915, and that cost them 750,000 dead and 1.5 million wounded, and that gave them Mussolini. Italy was quite fine in 1914. The last thing Italy needed is World War I. Okay, at least the Spanish had the capacity to stay out of the war, right? But everybody was offering Italy more territory. So Italy came in and lost 40 years of her history as a result of doing so. Here, you've got a vacuum of power in the East. How would you like to be Polish? About 30 million, 33 million people stuck between Bolshevik Russia and Germany, and both of them want part of your territory. Okay? This is the Balkanization of Eastern Europe. Inherently unstable. Regardless of how it was going to happen, Germany was going to take back some of that territory it had lost. And regardless of how it was going to happen, Russia was going to take back some of that territory it had lost. The only thing that could really have helped to stabilize this in some serious way would have been what? How could this have been stabilized? Who had the capacity to perhaps stabilize it? Pardon? Us. Us. U.S., us. We weren't ready. Sorry. It took another 25 years. We weren't ready until World War II, after World War II. That's the Marshall Plan. That's the Truman Doctrine. We weren't ready. We believed even later that our entrance in the war was a mistake. Culturally, psychologically, economically we could have been ready, politically we could have been ready, mentally we were not ready yet to do it, George.
Britain could have handled its role in the World War very differently.
Oh, it could have. It could have. And then it might not have been as much of a world war. This fella says Britain shouldn't have entered.
You could argue that either it shouldn't have entered at all and play that card dramatically prior to August 1914 in a much better way than Britain did, or you could also argue that it should have fought a traditional British war, a la the Napoleonic Wars, of being the finance man of the Allies and using the great British Navy.
Tell me what would have happened if they had done number two.
The Sheepshead plan would have worked. And
correct. France would have been defeated.
They were defeated 30 years earlier. It wasn't the end of the world.
Right.
And you could argue that it would have been better for France, let alone the rest of Europe.
That is counterfactual history. It is fun. And he has written a book on that also. This guy, you know, every time I go to sleep, he writes a book. This is Niall Ferguson, Ferguson, and he has actually written a book on counterfactual history. And he actually argues, well, there is a debate between these two monsters as to what would have been better. And Ferguson has this debate within himself. I don't want to get into it now, but maybe later we can. Of what would it have been better, except that the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm by 1918 already had an enlarged appetite. One of the developments during the war that occurred because of the intensity of it is that instead of having small war goals, they all got fat stomachs, and they all raised their goals. Germany's goal then became virtually all of Middle Europe, the annexation of Belgium, the annexation of the whole French coast. England would have become an appendage of Germany. With that kind of economic might, the Germans could have taken apart the British Empire. They could have outbuilt them in navies. They would have caught them, and they would have paid. So it might have been better than World War II. Okay? You wouldn't have had a Hitler. You wouldn't have had a Hitler. But it would have been a draconian peace. How do we know that? We know that because of the peace they imposed on the Russians at Brest-Litovsk, in which they took virtually half of all that was there to take.
If that's true, why didn't the Franco-Prussian War lead to Germany overwhelming Britain?
Good. Wonderful. Because it was a different Germany, and there was a Bismarck. Okay? And Bismarck had limited goals and limited aims, because Bismarck understood that if Germany got too strong and threatened all of the others, sooner or later what would happen is all of the others would come together and destroy Germany and make her pay. And that's what they finally did when Germany went over the line. Far, far, far over the line. So that was one of the reasons. And secondly, Germany wasn't even thinking that way. They had limited aims at that point, very, very limited aims, different concept. The last third of the 19th century changed a great deal of perception and culture, psychology, and it just wasn't in the cards at that point. And Bismarck himself was the first one to say, we can go just so far. Another question back there, yeah?
I didn't want to take away from the discussion if you wanted to continue it. The other question that I had related to the collapse of monarchical governments in
Yes.
Europe. All right, because at the beginning of World War I, you had a Kaiser in Germany, you had a Tsar in Russia, you had an emperor in Austria-Hungary, and you had a sultan in the Ottoman Empire. And at the end of World War I, they were all gone.
They're all gone, right. So the monarchical governments...
My question then was, is that part of what creates the instability in the...
It is part of what creates the instability, but the monarchical governments do not perform well during the war. They end up losing the war, and therefore they end up collapsing. They wouldn't have collapsed if they hadn't lost. Okay? And monarchy can be as... It marks the end of monarchy, and it marks the end of aristocracy as really the peak of what it meant to be civil. In some ways,
My understanding of the reading was that the war was caused by some of the conflicting interests of the monarch.
It was, but it was also caused by the conflicting interests of the democratic states, France and England. So I wouldn't call England a monarchy at that point, but they all could be equally dangerous. It's just that if you get a bad monarch, it's more dangerous, much more dangerous, because the most important thing about democracy is the balance of power is so very, very, very important. The balance of power is just radically important, and having three branches of government and a free press and all of those other things helps make us free, or somewhat free. No one is ever free. We're all limited by what we have. But yes, Larry, this is a dear, dear, dear friend of Al Gendeby, who was my mentor at Lafayette and my second father, and one of his dearest friends was Larry Houston from Philadelphia. How many of you knew Al Gendeby? Okay, you're fortunate to have known him.
You're all lucky.
Yeah.
I feel lucky today, incidentally. You said earlier that was the collapse of the Russian Empire, and I don't know whether the word empire really has any particular meaning or value for that matter, but okay, to me that was the collapse of the European segment
Correct.
of the Russian
Correct.
Empire.
Correct.
When the Soviet Union collapsed, more of the empire
Correct.
went with it, and a lot of the empire is still there. All those eastern states that
Yes.
emperors
Right.
decided they wanted to attach are still there and still attached.
Yes, absolutely. And the Soviets rebuild their empire after World War II, and they expand it after World War II, and they maintain it for 40, 50 years. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. This might be a good time to stop for any more comments or questions that you have. Yes, go ahead.
With the unification of Germany in the 1860s, 1870s,
Yes.
what suddenly made all the dukedoms and principalities and small kingdoms inevitably come together, and how were they dropped?
They were defeated in war. Bismarck defeated them in 1866 in a war against the Austro-Hungarian, or what was then the Austrian Empire, became the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then in defeating France, German nationalism came together. They all continue to exist. They all still had some power, but in World War I, they lost their power. The central government took all power, and these separate places, the Bavarian army still existed, but the German army told the Bavarian army what to do. And then afterwards, that changes when the German Republic, it's no longer that same kind of federal system. So those things all collapse after World War I.
And was it the same way as in Italy, when they had, all the...
Yes. There's another map here. We just don't see it. Oh, no, we're not going to put that up. Okay, that's big. Italy was about 15 different colors. And that's the work of Cavour between 1855 and 1861. And then when Cavour, Garibaldi, Mazzini, but then when The Austro-Prussian War takes place. Lombardy and Venetia go to Italy, and when the Franco-Prussian War takes place, Rome goes to Italy. So that's how Italy becomes a unified country that way.
They were under a monarchy.
They're all under monarchies and dukedoms. Don't ever forget those dukedoms. They're adorable. Yes.
What do you think were the key causes of World War I, apart from the assassination of Archduke?
Okay, all right. That's a catalyst, not a cause. Okay, key causes of World War I. Going to take me way off target, but that's okay. Militarism, extreme militarism, meaning that war vitalism, become very, very much a part of modernist culture by the 1890s. They haven't had a real good war in a while. They kind of forgot what it was like. And the power of the military in each of the countries, but especially in Germany and in Austria and in Russia, also in England and France, but less so. So militarism is one extreme cause.
But in Germany with naval rivalry.
Naval race. Nationalism is one extreme cause. Okay, imperialism works both ways. It led to much increased tensions, but it was also a safety valve. And since you were taking away territory that didn't belong to anyone anyway, except the people who happened to live there, and you took that from them, so that was a football game. That was a soccer match elsewhere. It could be a safety valve, but it also caused much, much more tension. The alliance system, which tightened things up really, really badly. The whole nature of European culture, which was almost schizophrenic by World War I and was uglier after the war than it had been before the war. We have in documents in these books now that we didn't have when you went to school, but I use 3 different documents. One is French kids, another is Italian artists, the third is a German general. They're all saying the same thing. You're not a man if you haven't gone to war. And war is inherently good. And war creates civilization. So the real civilized person is the one who knows war. And all these guys are agreeing on it. Okay? Whereas the pacifist movements are weak and disorganized, et cetera, et cetera. And then, very, very importantly, the short war illusion. The idea that the war was going to be short and cost effective. So if it was a mistake, it'd be a small mistake. Okay? So instead of looking at the American Civil War, which is what this was, a European Civil War, okay? Instead of looking at the American Civil War, they looked at the Austro-Prussian War, 6 weeks, the Franco-Prussian War, 6 months. Each country was certain it would win. Each military was certain it would win. And then there were also the timetables. Russia was rearming from the defeat on the hands of the Japanese in 1905. The German military was afraid of Russia's rearming. And most importantly, in the Balkans, Serbia was threatening the structural legitimacy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and trying to destabilize the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It would be equivalent of Mexico trying to destabilize. Okay? 50 years from now, Mexico says, wait a minute. Arizona and Nevada and New Mexico and California, that's 80% ours. They want to come home. Oh. Well, that's what this was. This is all Slavic in here. And they want to build a large Slavic state, which is what happens over here. Okay? And then they love each other that when the empire collapses, the Russian Empire collapses, they kill each other again. Okay? Yes?
There's an excuse that the killing of Archduke Ferdinand was like a terrorist attack.
Exactly. That's what was used.
That's the excuse.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, sorry.
Sounds so much like today.
Mm-hmm. You know why?
That's why you use the word terrorist.
Because we haven't changed much. And that's where this guy starts his book. And that's where Freud, writing about World War I, starts his book. And what Freud says, he wrote a book, he wrote an essay in 1915. He wrote an essay in 1915 talking about the way in which this would destabilize and destroy European civilization. by taking away, ripping off all the sublimation of our instinct that we allow and produce in order to survive as a species, showing how the war ripped all that away. And then he concludes, in reality, our fellow citizens have not sunk so low as we feared, because they had never risen so high as we believed. Okay, and we are what we are. I like my OPSA sometimes more than some of the folks I know. I'm enough of an optimist. I'm enough of an optimist to believe that we can try to be better. Okay, but will we be better? We can try. It's our duty. I'll say it. But then again, I'm just a traditional bourgeois guy. These guys are all saying no. Your duty is to shoot for the stars. And if you have to trample over people, so be it. Yeah. Good. The answer could be no one, or the answer could be, in some sense, the United States did. Okay? And all of that would be based on your projection as to whether or not there had to be a World War II after World War I. Okay? And there, I don't know if any of you got the PMH Bell book, The 30 Years' War. The one thing I disagree with, or two things actually. Without an Adolf Hitler, there probably would not have been a World War II, at least not when and how it took place. Sometimes a particular leader is simply there who has enough will and enough sickness and enough vision and enough capability to make things happen and becomes one of those world historical figures. Lenin was also a world historical figure. The Bolsheviks might not have come into power without Lenin, because unlike Hitler, he knew when to stop. Okay? He said, you can make revolution or peace, or rather war. Revolution or war, you can't have both. So if we don't take the peace Germany's going to give to us, we'll lose our revolution. And he was the minority, but he stuck with it and forced them to go along with it. And later, when the whole revolution was coming apart at the seams, he steps back and he says, we got to loosen up on the people a little bit. Okay, not that he wasn't cruel and perverse in many, many ways, but he at least knew there were certain limits. So, no Hitler, no World War II. No Depression, no World War II. No Depression, no Hitler. And everybody is still conflicted about why the Depression happened, and was it a result of World War I, or was it just one of those cyclical things like what we are still at the end of, hopefully the very end of, right now. So that's where that 30 years thing falls down. But let me give you two of my last favorite quotes, though. One is by Barbara Tuchman and one is by Raymond Aron. Raymond Aron says, the principal causes of the Second World War resulted from the prolongation of the First War, and above all of the Russian Revolution, the fascist reaction in Italy and Germany. Okay. Tuchman, the deadlock of the war, fixed by the Marne, determined the future course of the war, the terms of the peace, and the shape of the interwar period and the conditions of the second round. Now, they're both kind of saying to you that this having happened, it was likely that the next in a whole series of things would have happened, except Adolf Hitler really, really should have been dead. Okay? I mean, he was a warrior. He was a runner. He took risks. Statistically, the fact that he survived is incredible.
But which part of...
All the way through. He was all the way through from 1915 on. The guy enlisted. He volunteered. Yeah. The worst. Flanders, and he loved it. Right. Yeah, he loved it. He loved it. He got gassed. He loved it. Okay? Yes, he didn't like too much. That really threw him off when he got gassed because he was temporarily blinded also. So this was really a disaster, not a disaster. The disaster was he didn't get gassed more. And the gas didn't work. And the Depression. So the two missing links are Hitler and the Depression. Without those two missing links, World War II becomes very unlikely. A different United States, World War II becomes very unlikely. But we weren't a different United States at that time. And we were the only ones who could have stabilized this thing more. Instead, what we did is not enter the League of Nations and not ratify the guarantee treaty we had promised to France, which allowed France to force Germany to continue to pay reparations. But don't feel so badly, because the French paid reparations out of the War of 1870 also. The German reparations were a pittance compared to what they took from Russia, and they only paid about 10% of it at most. Okay? What they did is they set their printing presses loose to pay the reparations. They inflated their own currency and destroyed their own middle class in order to pay the French off. Also, the war was financed by loans, which causes inflation. Products were reduced, which causes inflation. So the economic rubble of Germany after the war was horrendous, especially for the middle class, yes.
Doesn't Churchill say that Britain could have stopped World War II by standing up to...
You read that book? We're going to discuss that tomorrow. Okay. He says it. He says it, yes. Do I believe it? Yes. Yeah.
With the Weimar Republic and the German inflation, was that deliberate? Was that a deliberate attempt to devalue the currency so they could just pay them with?
A lot of the currency had already been devalued, okay, but during the war. The currency was devalued like the Italian currency by the war itself. Then they further devalued it, yes.
Reparations were in German marks. Correct?
Yes, yeah, that's right. So they wanted to pay them off in cheap marks. But if you believe that Germany couldn't have paid off that reparations, they could have paid that reparations. It wasn't a good thing to do. It was stupid. It was never going to be applied because they would have still been paying until 1988. Okay. Psychologically, it was impossible for that to have been applied. But Versailles, again, the effect of the war, the impact of the war, the Treaty of Versailles is a result of the nature of the war. Germany already showed what kind of treaty was going to be imposed. If Clemenceau didn't impose a severe treaty on Germany, he would have been hung by his own people. Marshal Foch thought he had caused another war by backing down from Wilson.
Yeah, but who else, was there any other influences or power over Clemenceau not to impose these?
No. And they did. Yeah, they cut him back. What he really wanted is a separate Rhineland territory in between France and Germany. You have Belgium, so he wanted Belgium and another Rhineland territory. Instead, this became a demilitarized zone. But they actually wanted a separate Rhineland state. And that's where we'll go back on tomorrow into this little discussion here. So they wanted a separate Rhineland state, and they wanted to keep Germany down. They wanted two things, the French. They wanted security, and they wanted reparations. One of the major reasons they didn't feel secure is we didn't ratify our security treaty, to which the Britons said, if the Americans don't ratify the security treaty, we don't ratify the security treaty. Sorry. To which the French say, then we got to keep the Germans down, which they do for 5 years. So I don't really think World War I ended with the Treaty of Versailles. I think World War I ended with the Locarno Treaty in 1925 and the German entry into the League of Nations in 1926. And by ended, I mean ended in a serious sense. Except that these books, and this is what's changed the most in the last 20 years, these books and a book by ex-teens, The Rites of Spring, tell us that the war didn't end. Because the war entered into modern memory in a total way. And by the end of the 1920s, every single village in France had a war memorial. And I don't know, how many of you have been to France? How many of you have gone into the countryside and what do you see when you go to the central part of any little town? See World War I memorials. You see a city hall, you see a church, and you see World War I memorials.
Yeah, the World War II monuments in England are always way smaller than the World War I monuments.
And in France by far. Okay? Sure. Yeah, that's what you see. Yeah, they gave up and they still lost a couple 100,000 troops, though. They really did, I agree, they gave up. They shouldn't be mentioned in the same name as England in World War II. These books emphasize the long-term psycho-cultural impact of World War I. Okay? These books emphasize the psycho-cultural impact and the socio-cultural impact of World War I. And there, the single most important word is dislocation, destabilization of cultures, of psyches, of values, of the meaning of the word truth, of minds, of beings, so that something like what Adolf Hitler stood for could make sense to a lot of people, or something like what Mussolini stood for could make sense to a lot of people. Now remember, Hitler had to wait till 1933. In Mussolini's case, it was 1922. Okay? So the Italians fell much, much, much more easily. By the time of the Treaty of Versailles, virtually every one of these countries had a democratic constitution, not the Soviet Union. By 1938, democracy was clearly the minority form of government everywhere in Europe, except in Scandinavia, in Britain. The Irish didn't think it was, but in Britain, in France, okay, in Switzerland, and in Czechoslovakia. Every single one of these other countries had one form of dictatorship or another. So powerful was the political destabilization from World War I. Yes?
You mentioned Ireland. I was going to point out that the one orange spot on the map that was not part of one of the defeated powers is the Republic of Ireland. Do you see that as that fact as being in any way directly or indirectly related to World War I or independent of that?
England almost had a civil war in 1914. They had passed the Irish Autonomy Act a third time. It was going to be law. The Protestants were armed to the teeth in Ireland. There was probably going to be a civil, Edward Carson, there was probably going to be a civil war. The single most important thing that David Lloyd George did, and he was a great war leader, equal to Churchill in World War II, but the single greatest thing he did after the war was overseeing Irish independence. So one of the other aspects of this, and I have a goose gander thing in my in the talk when I finish it in a regular way, is that heads or tails, which are you, heads or tails? One of the things that this war did also is radically accelerate the process of decolonization worldwide. Okay? Here was the superior great white race committing suicide. And what Europeans lost is both the power and, even more importantly, the will to power to control the rest of the world. And so you had revolutionaries occurring everywhere, getting worse during the 1920s and 1930s. Finally, within 20 years after World War II, all coming into fruition. And that was the acceleration of history that might have taken another century or more to take place. For those people, they would never agree to this, but it might have been better. Because in some cases, a slightly longer European stay might have left slightly more stability afterwards. I remember when my mentor in graduate school said that, and I yelled at him, "It's a terrible thing to say," and it might have been true. It's a terrible thing to say anyway, because how do you decide for other people's what that's going to mean? But the radical weakening of Europe made it possible for the whole third world to develop and emancipate itself. So one's loss was another's gain in that particular way. Yes, Judge Kelleher, class of 73.
Are you going to touch on the consequences of the war as they affect or create the modern Middle East in this at all?
No, but you can ask me. Because I used to teach a seminar in the Middle East, and I got so sick of it because I got so sick and depressed from it that I actually gave it up, even though I wasn't really an expert in it, but I became an expert in it. We needed it. I taught it. And then I taught something light for the last 10, 15 years, the Holocaust. So I exchanged teaching the Middle East, which is live people, and began to teach the Holocaust about 10, 12 years ago, which has given me, I must tell you, incredible joy, because the kind of students who take that course are just absolutely outstanding, and it's totally multicultural, and it is absolutely magnificent, as painful as it is. But the Middle East is more painful to me, okay, because it's here and now, and it doesn't move much. But if you have questions, please ask. I know the book, but I haven't read it.
The author sort of starts with before Balfour, and then just breaks down how the Allies planted the three sons of the one Saudi Arabian guy as the three new kings of the Middle East, and
Yeah.
it's been downhill ever since.
Yeah. And it was almost bound to be, because there was no political stabilization there at all anyway. And what do you have here? You have essentially 16th century cultures entering the 20th century with no time at all. How long does it take to go from the pre-French Revolution, the medieval world, to the post-French Revolution? You got the Renaissance, you got the Reformation, you have the Scientific Revolution in the 17th century, you have the Enlightenment in the 18th century. None of those processes took place in the Middle East. None. Okay? And they barely took place in Russia until the Enlightenment. There's no Scientific Revolution, there's just Peter the Great. Okay? So you're hoping to catapult a 15th century civilization into the 20th century when you've already inflamed it by conquering it. Right? And until World War I, it's still virtually all, nominally at least, in the hands of the Ottoman Empire, which at least is Islamic. Okay? But any more? Ask. No? Okay. I want to read something, and then just give you time to ask more questions. How many of you have read All Quiet on the Western Front? Okay, wonderful. If you haven't, please do. Please do. Now, if you really want to test yourself, read Solzhenitsyn, August 1914. It's torturous. It's 800 pages, but it reads like All Quiet on the Western Front, okay? And typically, a Russian book would take 800 pages to tell what remark, But it's magnificent. It's magnificent. So this is Paul Balmer in the end of All Quiet on the Western Front, the main character. He says, had we returned home in 1916 out of the suffering and the strength of our experiences, we might have unleashed a storm. Now, if we go back, we will be weary, broken, burnt-out, rootless, and without hope. We will not be able to find our way anymore. And men will not understand us. For the generation that grew up before us, though it has passed these years with us here, already had a home and a calling. Now it will return to its old occupations. The war will be forgotten. Not really, but. And the generation that has grown up after us will be strange to us and push us aside. We will be superfluous even to ourselves. We will grow older. A few will adapt themselves. Some others will merely submit, and most will be bewildered. The years will pass by, and in the end we shall fall into ruin. That's the lost generation. He wrote another book called The Road Back, the result of which was there was no road back. But here's another voice, and this is the work of Modris Eckstein's The Rites of Spring. If you really want to suffer, that's difficult. Jenna read it. The kids love it now. Many of them think it's the best book in the course. Is that possible? Yeah. No, but my essay question requires it now, though. It says comment on Eckstein's. The Rites of Spring. It's about the whole nature of the impact of the war on culture, especially German culture. So somebody else is writing, and he says, I had the good fortune to fight in the first two offensives and the last. These became the most tremendous impressions of my life. Tremendous because now for the last time, as in 1914, the fight lost the character of defense and assumed that of attack. A sigh of relief passed through the trenches and the dugouts of the German army when at length, after more than 3 years' endurance in the enemy hell, the day of retribution came. Once again the victorious battalions cheered and hung the last wreaths of immortal laurel on their banners, rent by the storm of victory. Once again the songs of the fatherland roared to the heavens along the endless marching columns, and for the last time the Lord's grace smiled on his ungrateful children. So who wrote that? So the majority of people felt like Remarque. They never wanted to do it again. It's over. Never, never, never again. But a large minority of people felt like Hitler. This is male bonding on a level that can scarcely be imagined.
Well, there's a good word for it, malevolence.
Now, what happens in the 20s, 30s, is that the people who believe the way Remarque believes are pitted against the people who believe the way Hitler believes, and who do you think is going to win that battle? When the United States is still in isolation. Couple more questions, yes. And then we'll go back over to Larry, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Was his influence so naive and idealistic that it corrupted the peace process and left the United States in isolation?
Not really. I think his politics at home was worse. He should have brought Lodge and the others in with him. He should have done a better job of politicking at home. The Treaty of Versailles is a product of the war itself. There couldn't have been a much different treaty. That new Macmillan book, this thick, Peacemaking 1919, even she says it wasn't so bad of a treaty, considering the nature of the war. If the Germans had won, the treaty would have been much, much, much more severe. If the Americans had not balanced out the French, the treaty would have been much, much more severe. One of the problems was, and this is the genius, the malevolent genius of the German generals, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, is they sued for peace before the armies were on German territory. So the Germans never believed they had lost the war. It had been stolen from them by communists, socialists, and Jews.
Well, Wilson had a stroke, I think, within a year after he came back from the treaty, and so Mrs. Wilson became president.
Right.
So, I mean, there was no chance for Wilson to sell the treaty.
Well, he was a casualty of the war because he tried to sell the treaty with that trip across the country, and he killed himself. Basically, he gave it every last ounce of strength that he had. And so, Keynes calling him a blind and dumb Don Quixote playing games,
I'm thinking
where Keynes is correct is there was no economic planning for the rehabilitation of Europe until 1924. Who's involved in it? America. 1928. Who's involved in it? America. The Dawes and the Young Plan, American involvement, 1924 and 1928, we were the only ones capable of providing some economic stability. When we go down, they all go down. Larry. Yeah. Larry, and then we'll come. Yes. Yeah, turnips, if they could get turnips. Home front was starving. That's a statement.
Why is Ukraine in the orange? That's a hole in my history because I don't know what that signifies.
That's bizarre because the Russians took them. So that could be a mistake. 1924, I would say the Ukraine should be yellow. Okay? The Ukraine and the Poles had a war. The Russians and the Poles had a war. The Russians finally took the Ukraine. And I think by 1924 that was already, the end of 1924 that would have shifted over. End of 24 it would have shifted. Yes?
You mentioned that there was
Coming
no
back, I forget.
war in Germany. Wasn't Mein Kampf based on the idea that Germany was blamed for the war and that there was an impossible peace that was
That's correct. Those are his assumptions, okay? His assumption is that Germany is blamed for the war, but what Germans really, really were saddened by is that they lost. Because they didn't know they were losing. As late as 1918, even politicians were being lied to so badly that they thought they were still winning the war, and they almost were. The German offensive of March of 1918 almost was successful. Then you get the Second Battle of the Marne, and they're stopped. But the German people was totally unprepared for the loss, psychologically. The truth and falsehood were just upside down. So since they were not occupied directly by the Allied troops, they didn't realize how badly they had lost. With every month that followed, another 200,000 American troops were landing. And the Allies were eating hot meals. And the German soldiers themselves, like the people on the home front, were virtually starving by that time. Okay? And they had run out of everything. They had run out of everything. So Hitler was one of hundreds of thousands of people who felt the same way. Hundreds of thousands of people. Just as Mussolini in Italy. Except he was more extreme. Much. Yes, and not just the Nazi Party. There were tens and tens and tens of parties like the Nazi Party in Germany after the war. Groupings all over the place. These Free Corps rogue groupings, people still kept their weapons in many cases. The army withdrew intact. They didn't surrender. Yes, I'm going to have this youngster, Mr. Weissman. Jaron, that's not bad. Okay, yes.
After the war, since the Ottoman Empire, as you mentioned, was huge,
Yes.
considering.
Well, not so huge anymore. It had shrunken during the 19th century.
But how did, considering some of the countries ended up being controlled by England and France?
It found its hero, Kemal Ataturk, and he beat them, and he saved the empire, or he saved Turkey. And then he tried to secularize it, and as we speak, it is becoming less secular, and it's very problematic, very frightening.
How did monarchies in Saudi Arabia or Iran or Iraq or countries like that, how did they end up getting monarchies?
Well, they got monarchies because they were given territory by the British or the French, or they were already there in clans. So they already existed, okay, and they were already under the power of the Ottoman Empire, as was all of North Africa. They all had fiefdoms. They were beys and days and sultans. These are names of, that's like saying monarch, okay, in these civilizations. And what happens is that this whole area is taken by the British and the French and the Italians from the 1880s up to 1914. Then they take the Middle East afterwards as the Turkish Empire collapses there. Yeah, part of that, very, very slightly part of it, yes. Yeah, much more independent of clans, large extended clans. Yes.
I once read that the politicians in Germany were considering negotiating for peace, but Krupp was making so much money by supplying the artillery that they persuaded them to continue the war. Is that true?
You would have to look to a book called The Guns of Krupp by Fritz Stern for that answer. Now, Krupp was certainly making lots of money, and there were politicians in Germany who were interested in and trying to sue for peace, just as there were by 1917 in France and in England. The problem was much, much worse than Krupp or any other single entity like that. The problem was on what terms. The war was still being fought on Belgian and French soil. How could they have created a peace after, by that point, you have millions and millions of dead and disabled people? Okay? And by that point, the political leaders were terrified that if they began to negotiate, they could never get the troops to fire a shot again. So the Krupps may have had some input into that, but ultimately the generals were more powerful than the Krupps during the war. But I may be wrong, and you would find that from Fritz Stern in The Guns of Krupp.
This is along the same lines. I'm wondering how they were able to prolong this horrible carnage and convince the soldiers to keep doing it.
Great.
There were mutinies, right?
Great, yes. Many mutinies. There were even mutinies in Germany. They call it the Silent Mutiny. People started going home in 1918. You got to read things like this and the Ecksteins. They go into great, great, great detail, and no one still has the answer. Those are the kinds of questions that people ask today, and a lot of it is in this book also. One of the things they say is that the immediate trench and platoon became such a surrogate family that, as you can see and remark, the soldiers are more at home with their brothers in the trenches than with their sisters in the home front. And by it's not that they're buying out of the war as war, but into their need to do their duty to help the brother. So a lot of it is honor, a lot of it is patriotism, a lot of it is, what, if I don't, then I get shot maybe, but a lot of it is, I have to do my bit because my brethren are doing their bit. And what this guy shows, which is incredible, Wilfred Owen, one of the greatest, dies the last days of the war, one of the greatest British poets of the 20th century. He fights to get back on the home front. Not because he wants to fight, he wants to be with his boys. He wants to be with his pals.
Do you think that young people today would have that same kind of devotion? No, Band of Brothers. Every army is like that.
Some of my friends were fighting that.
It's a real question. You know, nationalism does not have the same exact intensity that it had at this time. The belief in anything does not have the exact same intensity that it had at that time. The information, a lot of the information is there, and the state doesn't have the same level of control over our minds as it had at that time. But my guess is that given the species that we are, boy, it seems like those Islamic terrorists are hanging in. And pardon? The towel heads. They're hanging in, and we got to hang in for the long run also. And it's a different kind of war, and the duration is going to be a long, long, long time. We have different kinds of wars at this point. But if we got into a situation like that, as Americans, we've never had to do that since the Civil War. We did it during the Civil War more than any other time. But it's not been on our turf. It's not been on our territory. So we don't know. We don't know if we have the capability of doing what the Russians have done so many times. But they've done it because there were howitzers pointed at the back of their head. I mean, you know, Stalin killed anyone who just wouldn't go forward with. Yes?
I think that element of brothering still stays. I mean, from
I
what
do
we
too.
hear of friends and friends of friends who are in Iraq, it's like people would sign up because they wanted to pay off their loans. Mm-hmm. And they stay longer than they have to because of the idea of my brothers are there, my sisters are there. And they stay and they don't have to.
I think that that is true, and one of the greatest tributes ever paid to me was by a Vietnam vet taking my course on World War I, who said to me that I got it right. Okay? That for at that moment in that class, for whatever reason, that answer was what he was thinking, you know, and that you know, once you're there, everything else changes, and the beforehand is erased after a while, I think. And yes, Larry, I'm sorry.
I'm reading all this stuff, and I'm trying to figure out, does it have any lessons for today? And it seems to me, that they're only bad lessons. You said earlier that they couldn't get out because they can't stop because they had no choices.
Yeah.
And if that ain't what we've got right now,
Right.
I don't know what is. We can't stop because it's politically impossible to stop, and we have no choices.
I used to think that I knew the answers to most historical questions. And I will tell you with great sadness and much humility that I no longer believe I have those answers. All right? In the world that we're in right now, I am at a loss. And I have great difficulty determining what I really think is correct or incorrect in the kind of situations we're now in. And I'm not usually someone who has problems making choices. So I will tell you that this world that we live in is really, really complicated and really messy. I think in terms of tomorrow's comments, one lesson to be learned is always consider the worst case scenario. Always be aware of a worst case scenario. It doesn't mean you can avoid it, but you must think about it. These people should have thought about their worst case scenarios more carefully. War was likely in 1914 or 1915 or 1916. War was likely. They should have thought about their worst case scenarios, and they didn't sufficient at all.
At what point, people on the home front, let's say in Germany, France, or England, did they finally figure out what these losses were? You know, the very first battle, you're losing 60,000 people. I know it's not today's day where you know immediately.
After the war, they didn't know. That was all censored. It was censored. They really didn't know. They just knew there were less young men around. Oh no, oh no, oh no, they were censored. Yeah, oh, they were censored, sure. Yeah, they really censored.
If I can change the subject, the technology, the military technology of World War I, I've always thought that the technology condemned the combatants to a war of attrition.
Yes, it was.
All right, and
on the Western Front.
Okay, yes, I'm speaking of the Western Front. With the advent of the machine gun and rifled artillery,
barbed wire,
gas, all right.
Good stuff.
These are essentially weapons which favor a defensive war and a war of attrition, and that the role of armor and air power was just in its infancy during World War I.
Correct.
Essentially invented in World War I. Correct. Was this foreseeable in any way by the generals or the military people of that time, or were they still? I mean,
they were so full of themselves. Those crackers were so bullish, and they all had the same feeling. Forward. Anyone who talked like that would have been considered I can't say it, literally.
I mean, it ended up because of the scene.
Literally, they wouldn't listen to anyone who would attack those beliefs. Willpower. The greatest French philosopher at that time was named Henri Bergson. How did France win at the Battle of the Marne? Joan of Arc won the Battle of the Marne. Now, Bergson was Jewish. So what's he got to do with Joan of Arc? He's French. Okay? So they heard from him, Joan of Arc. So what does that mean? The will of Joan of Arc, impregnated in the soul of these French youth, allowed us to stop the Hun. When people are thinking like that, now this guy is a very civilized and brilliant human being. I mean, this is
that's feeling nothing.
Well, kind of putting together that thought in the previous point where you answered that question of you can't answer whether Palestine, Israel problem will ever be solved or the Afghanistan, Taliban. One of my professors when I was in college once in an off moment at his house once said about something completely different was he paused and he said, man is not a completely rational animal.
That's right. That's exactly right. And World War I radicalized the irrationality by stripping away the sublimated portions of our character. And they were all up top. Okay? Ready to explode with unemployment, with inflation, with fear, with polarization, with hatred. Okay, let's stop. You guys are phenomenal.